Welcome back to the Steele Report. Well, the tickets are set, and without question, it's going to be a really different kind of presidential campaign from here on out. Let's get some thoughts on that from KWWL political analyst Dr. Chris Larimer of the University of Northern Iowa. And we said at the start of the program here, don't judge us because we've taken our masks off here on campus, though. But we are out here on the beautiful campus here at UNI, and the sun is shining, so we feel pretty safe, and we're more than 6 feet apart. So you've been watching the conventions.
Yep.
Joe Biden had to give a very important speech.
Our current president has failed in his most basic duty to the nation. He's failed to protect us.
You watched it, I assume. So what did you think of it?
Yeah, I thought he did a good job. Certainly talking about, I think his speech matched with the theme of the entire Democratic convention in terms of talking about, his managerial capacity, his ability to lead, how it's in his opinion, a stark contrast to what we currently have in the White House. Talking about his ability to not only relate to the average voter, but understand the concerns of the average voter, particularly during a time of crisis with COVID-19 pandemic, the economic downturn, and that he would provide, a turn in a different direction in terms of reassuring voters, providing more, trying to instill more trust in the political system here in the United States, more trust in the American political system around the world. And so, he seemed to drive that message home. It was a pretty consistent theme throughout the convention.
A lot of people look at the campaign and they think Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, they just went at each other almost in hatred in some aspects. And now here they are coming out as the team for the Democratic Party. Do voters, do they understand that, how that works? Yeah.
I think they do, and particularly if you're talking about Democratic voters, they understand kind of the coming together at the end, because everybody has to run their own campaign during the primary, and everybody, as we talk about in political science, everybody sort of runs to the extremes during the primary, then they need to come back to the middle in the general election. And so I think for voters who are actively engaged, they understand that process.
Was Joe Biden's speech more important to him than the president's speech was to him this week? I heard a lot of people say this was the speech of a lifetime of importance for Joe Biden, that he had been preparing for this for his whole life. And it was done live, but obviously with help of a teleprompter, and the president had that same help as well, though he strays from it occasionally. So how important was that speech to Biden compared to the president's speech earlier this week?
Well, I think for Biden, it is the speech of a lifetime. This is his third time running for president. He's now the nominee. And what the Democratic campaign is obviously focused on is not only mobilizing their base, which both parties have to do, but they, from what we've heard, is that they see an opportunity to reach out to disaffected Trump voters or more moderate voters in the electorate. And so for his speech, he's trying to appeal to that group, to try to appeal to a broader base than what the president's campaign seems to be doing. And if he's able to successfully do that, I think Democrats believe that they have a real shot of defeating Trump in November. But that's why I think that speech carried more weight for Biden, is that they saw it as an opportunity to potentially to reach beyond their base.
So the debates will be coming up too, and the Pence-Harris debate is almost as much anticipated as the Trump-Biden debate, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, and you can think back even to the Biden-Sarah Palin debate back in 2008, that there was a lot of anticipation there. So again, you have I think we're at a point now, particularly with the 2020 presidential election, where everything is so polarized that these debates, the build-up to the debates, take on a little bit of extra significance, because there is such a stark contrast between the two parties, between the two candidates, between even voters within the two parties. As far as active registered voters, public opinion polling shows that there's increasing animosity between the two sides. And so, the lead up or the build up to these events carries a little bit of extra weight. The question always is, though, after these debates, to what extent do they really matter? Are we talking about these debates as sort of persuasive events in terms of moving voters one way or the other? Political science research would suggest that they probably don't carry a lot of weight in that regard. In other words, you're not going to take a voter who's Democrat and move them to the Republican, and vice versa, Republican to Democrat. It's really maybe trying to reach out to that small slice of the electorate that is undecided, but even within that group, there's quite a bit of variation. And so it's hard to know how much these debates really move the needle one way or the other, particularly at the vice presidential level, where yes, that's part of the ticket, but generally when people go to vote, they're voting for the top of the ticket. They're voting for the presidential nominees.
Now, earlier this week, we saw the First Lady, Melania Trump, deliver a speech. What kind of weight does that carry, do you think? She wasn't really in attack mode at all.
No, it had a very different tone to that debate, but she certainly, even though it was a different tone, she certainly carried some of the same themes that we heard from earlier speakers at the Republican National Convention in terms of that the president is going to restore, in their words, restore order, and try to rein in violence that they see, and that's their theme. But again, as with debates, it's really hard to know if conventions matter. And that sounds silly because they spend months and months preparing for these, spend a lot of money on them, but there's more and more research coming out as far as the so-called convention bounce, that bounce is getting smaller and smaller. And in part for the reasons we were talking about with debates is the electorate's more polarized. There are fewer undecideds who are out there. And so it's not as though people are going to be kind of a casual watcher or a casual observer of these conventions. If you're tuned into the conventions night after night, you've probably made up your mind. There used to be convention bounces, and they've really gone down to the point of just being 2 to 3 points at most last several election cycles. And again, they all speculate that it's probably because fewer undecideds in the electorate. You have conventions that are back to back, so you really don't have that time for the bounce to develop. And then just the electorate is so polarized. People have moved into their camps. They're so entrenched. They really don't consider the opinions of the other side. So it's interesting to think about how much these conventions really matter. And I don't know how, if we'll really ever get a good measure of that.
So the conventions are over. What's next? This is going to be a kind of different, amazingly different kind of campaign, isn't it?
It's going to be absolutely a very different campaign. We have the debates coming up, and those will be interesting to watch to see if we see any movement there. There's always talk about an October surprise, whether or not that actually happens. But I think that, what to watch now, obviously, and as we spoke to this a few weeks ago, is how the candidates campaign if they can't be in person, and we still see the campaigns adapting to that, doing more things virtually, and how that voter outreach is working, and whether or not it's working, how effective it is. But then also just the discussion around vote by mail and universal vote by mail. I think that's going to be one of the things to continue to watch to see, is that discourage, or not necessarily discouraging voters, but is that raising any concerns among voters? Or are you seeing more people? Are you seeing people more likely to show or to request a ballot? Are they more engaged with the voting process? Are they more concerned about it, and so they want to make sure that they get their vote counted? I think watching how that story develops is going to be, key to understanding how voter turnout looks in November.
And because of President Trump.
And Governor Reynolds had a spotlight for a time this week at the convention. What does that do for her as far as projecting her as a national player, though the problems here at home that she faces with the derecho and still concern about COVID-19? Where does that place her?
Well, it does raise her profile, certainly, when you're on that stage. And it certainly helps her try to align with the administration, at the same time as trying to project, the image of a leader who's able to manage a crisis. I think more generally, with Governor Reynolds speaking and Senator Ernst speaking at the Republican National Convention, I think that's a real effort or an understanding maybe by the Republican Party that Iowa is still very much a swing state, that you have our governor and one of our U.S. senators speaking at the RNC, and particularly for Senator Ernst, who's in a very tough re-election bid. I think that shows that the Republican Party, the Trump campaign, is concerned about Iowa, or at least that it's going to be more competitive than it was in 2016.
Were there any speeches that really stood out from either party in the conventions to you?
I don't think anything necessarily stood out. Like I said, I think both were pretty consistent. There was certainly the first couple of nights of the Republican National Convention, the tone was a little stronger than the Democratic National Convention. But I think, again, it was interesting that both sides were really talking about who would be the better leader, who would be the better manager in a crisis, who would be able to, correct the economy. And they were essentially making the same argument, but coming at it from two different angles.
Now I notice that both Marionette Miller Meeks and Rita Hart are running ads. I think Hart might have been on a little bit earlier, but that's going to be an interesting race, isn't it?
It is, and it's, as we've been getting closer and closer to this election, if you look at the 4 congressional House seat races in Iowa, really 3 out of the 4 are starting to move into that category of being essentially toss-ups, with the exception of the 4th district out in western Iowa. And so I think, you know, anytime you have an open seat, what the research will tell you is that it's automatically more competitive than it has been in the past. And so I think that's what we're seeing with that 2nd congressional district. And again, this was a district that Trump won in 2016, and now in the absence of an incumbent, I mean, that opens up the competition, because these congressional races so often get consumed by what's going on at the presidential level that, you know, it's hard for either candidate to really make an individual statement or make an individual case. And so I think just watching how the two candidates campaign and then understanding how that race relates to what's happening at the presidential level.
And as always, thanks to Dr. Chris Larimer of UNI, and also Waterloo Mayor Quentin Hart for being on this week's program. That's it for the Studio Report for this week. We'll be right back here with more next week. We'll see you then.